Welcome to the fourth geopolitical commentary of the Edablab, dated May 25th, 2026. Today's commentary will be different than the others. It will be more concerned with epistemology, the nature of knowledge, and more specifically, it will be discussing the return of Arab civilization, since its paralysis occurred and its potential was disrupted after World War One, World War Two. So our commentary will be entitled From the Hejaz Railway to Adab: Why the Arab World's Civilizational Return is Reshaping the Global Order. Our commentary will be split into 5 parts. So let's begin. Part 1: The Post-War Order and the Desacralization of the World. August 1945 wasn't just the end of World War II. It was the moment the world revealed its true or new operating system. With a single decision, the victors of World War II exposed the logic of this new order, that entire cities, entire populations could be reduced to a cold calculation. How many lives to erase, how much destruction to unleash, simply to secure a strategic objective. The atomic bomb didn't simply fall on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It fell on the idea, or it collapsed the idea, that human life was sacred. And what arose from that flash was not an anomaly, it was a revelation, a blueprint for a world willing to justify the unthinkable in the name of power. This is the story of how that logic was born and how it still shapes everything around us today. As the ashes settled after World War II, the world was carved into spheres. The United States and the Soviet Union each claimed universality, each imposing order, each compressing the vast plurality of human existence into a single binary. Either you're with us or you're against us. What emerged was not, what emerged was more than a geopolitical map. It was a transformation in how the world itself was understood. Geography was stripped of its sacredness. Land became territory to be administered. People became populations. Human value became instrumental rather than inherent. In earlier traditions, Islamic and the broader Abrahamic tradition, land was never just physical ground. It was entrusted space, bound to meaning, responsibility, to be honored, and anchored in a moral order. Human life was not something to be weighed against strategic interest. However, modern international relations, or a secular international relations order, formalized a different logic. Its most important thinkers didn't celebrate this shift. They actually diagnosed it. For instance, in Politics Amongst Nations, published in 1948 by Hans Morgenthau, he warns that a politics reduced to interest, detached from ethics, would become unstable and dangerous. The renowned German lawyer Carl Schmitt, in his 1932 book called The Concept of the Political, he exposed the consequences of a secular order, or an order that becomes secularized. He says once political life loses its grounding in transcendence, in the metaphysical, if you will, it collapses into pure antagonism. The only thing it sees is friend or enemy. Also, Eric Vogelin in 1952, in his great book, which I recommend to everyone, called The New Science of Politics, he argues that modernity suffered from a deeper disorder. And that order is caused by the attempt to sever reason from revelation, to replace transcendence with systems of control. In other words, severing transcendence from the immanent. He actually writes, and I quote, "The crisis of our time is not a crisis of power, but a crisis of order in the soul," end quote. However, the system persisted after World War II, refined through the language of liberal order, law, and institutions. And it retained a specific core, which is selective justice, uneven application, and the instrumentalization of life. What we are witnessing today is not its breakdown as much as we're witnessing its exposure. Part 2, crisis of legitimacy and the reawakening of moral epistemology. Recent conflicts, especially those involving the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other with its militias, have made a long-standing contradiction impossible to ignore. Across the Arab world, a growing perception has taken root that principles such as international law, human rights, and universal norms are applied selectively. And this is something that we've discussed in my previous commentaries. The issue is no longer only policy, it is credibility. And this marks a deeper rupture in the international order. Because what is collapsing is not simply trust in particular actors, but trust in the epistemology that underpins the modern international systems, its claims to neutrality, universality, and moral coherence. In response, something older and yet not yet antiquated is reemerging. An Arab moral epistemology that insists on re-sacralizing what modern politics stripped of meaning. And what do I mean by meaning? When I say meaning, we're speaking of something precise. The idea that land carries moral responsibility, not just strategic value. It's the idea that human life possesses inherent dignity, not instrumental utility. It also means the idea that justice is indivisible, not a tool to be allocated according to interest. In this view, land is not merely strategic space, but a locus of trust, belonging, and obligation. Human life is not collateral, but sacred and irreducible. Justice cannot be partitioned without dissolving its legitimacy. Arab epistemology is not a rejection of politics or strategy. It is a refusal to accept that politics must operate without moral anchoring. It is, at its core, a reassertion of a simple truth. Order without meaning, without moral grounding, without a sense of the sacred, cannot endure. Part 3, geoeconomics. Syria and the return of geography. The same crisis of meaning and legitimacy shaping global politics is now reshaping geoeconomics. Before Arab geography was desacralized, the region's connective tissue reflected a very different worldview. In 1908, pretty much at the closing of the Ottoman Empire, which officially collapsed in the 1920s, the Ottoman Empire completed the Hejaz Railway, linking Damascus to Medina, not merely as a transport corridor, but as a civilizational artery. Damascus, for those who know, is not just a city. It was the heart of the Umayyad world, a center from which Arab civilization radiated outward with all of its contradictions and beauty. From Damascus, the Umayyads built the great cities of Al-Andalus, Cordoba, Sevilla, Granada, cities that became global capitals of learning, philosophy, architecture, and scientific exchange. They embodied civilizational pluralism, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived, studied, and created together. They represented a model of socialization, not fragmentation, a world where geography connected rather than divided. Medina, on the other hand, was the spiritual anchor of the Islamic world, a city of moral gravity, prophetic legacy, and communal meaning. The Hejaz Railway united these two poles, a civilizational center on the Mediterranean and a spiritual center in the depths of Arabia, a political heartland and a sacred heartland, woven together through geography, purpose, and meaning. Western powers understood the significance of this unity. During World War I, they blew up the railway, fragmenting a geography that was once held through shared meaning rather than imposed borders. Today, that history is returning with new clarity. As conflicts involving the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other destabilize the region, a long-held assumption has collapsed that connectivity can be engineered without coherent geography. The region is rediscovering what the Hejaz Railway once embodied, that geography is not an obstacle to be bypassed, but a foundation to be honored. When geography is ignored, it reasserts itself. When meaning is stripped away, vulnerability expands. And in this reawakening, Syria returns to the center of the Arab world, not as a crisis to be managed, but as a geography that cannot be excluded without destabilizing everything around it. This is why Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Arab capitals have reopened channels with Damascus, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a strategic correction, an acknowledgement that no regional system can be coherent while one of its central land bridges remains fragmented. Syria is not simply a political life. It is a connective hinge between the Mediterranean and the Arab Peninsula, an inland alternative when maritime routes are threatened, a stabilizing corridor for any long-term regional architecture. The revival of the Hejaz Railway and the emergence of new overland routes signals a deeper shift, a return to geography that is not merely functional, but civilizational. If connectivity is to survive in an age of disruption, it must be built on integrated, resilient, meaningful geography, not on fragile alignments or single points of failure. And that requires reintegrating spaces that were fragmented, isolated, or deliberately set aside. Part 4. Arab strategic adaptation, convergence with differentiated methods. The return of geography has produced a parallel return of strategy. Across the Arab world, what we are witnessing is not disintegration, but adaptive convergence, a shared response to a shifting global order, expressed through different methods, but oriented towards the same horizon. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and other GCC countries are navigating a similar constellation of pressures: uncertainty in US-Israeli commitments, security challenges involving Iran and Israel, exposure to global economic volatility, the fragility of maritime choke points, and the need to stabilize cross-border geographies long treated as peripheral. Their responses differ in tempo and technique, but not in direction. The UAE and Saudi Arabia, for instance, have moved with great assertiveness, diversifying their economic systems, re-engaging regional geographies, for instance, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. They're expanding partnerships across multiple global power centers, especially Europe. And we've seen this recently in Spain, Italy, and France, reinforcing selective security arrangements, investing in overland connectivity that reduces dependence on vulnerable maritime routes. And crucially, they are advancing projects that are actively being built, revived, or expanded today. For instance, the development road between Iraq and Turkey is a flagship Iraqi project linking the Gulf to Turkey and Europe through rail and highway networks. Saudi Arabia's Trans-Arab Railway, linking the GCC and Jordan. UAE and Saudi investments in Levantine ports and logistics, whether in Lebanon or in Syria. Meanwhile, Iraq is repositioning itself as a logistical hinge between the Gulf, the Levant, and Turkey. Lebanon, despite its internal crisis, remains a Mediterranean node whose stability affects the entire Levant. Syria, as I mentioned, is the indispensable land bridge whose reintegration determines whether regional connectivity can be coherent rather than fragmented. These moves do not signal a departure from regional order. They represent an evolution within it, an attempt to preserve stability under altered conditions. What appears as divergence is in reality a form of collective experimentation, a search for how to sustain order when its previous guarantees no longer hold. The Arab states are not abandoning the system. They are adapting to the exposure of its limits and failures. And in doing so, they are shaping the contours of what comes next. Part 5, Adab, responsibility, and the sacralization of order. So, what then follows from this moment? Not merely a redistribution of power, but a question of grounding. Because the crisis we are witnessing is not only geopolitical, it is civilizational. The modern order, as I said in part 1, desacralized politics. It stripped it of transcendence, reduced it to management, to control, to calculation. And in doing so, it produced power without restraint, law without consistency, and order without meaning. Against this, the Arab Islamic tradition offers not a competing system of domination, but a different orientation altogether. It offers an ethic, adab. As I said previously, adab is not etiquette in the superficial sense. It is the discipline of placing things in their proper order. Power within limits, knowledge within humility, action within responsibility. Adab is not merely a virtue, it is an epistemology, a way of knowing and ordering the world. One that does not sever reason from revelation, but harmonizes them. It harmonizes al-aql wal-naql. One that sees knowledge not as domination, but as trust, amana. One that refuses to reduce the world to the material alone. And this orientation is not unique to Islam. It resonates across the Abrahamic inheritance. The Hanif, which is the laqab or the nickname of Prophet Abraham, the Hanif, the upright, represents the primordial orientation towards truth, justice, and moral clarity. The teachings of Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, established law as responsibility, not domination. The teachings of Jesus, peace be upon him, restored mercy as a corrective to power. The teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, synthesized governance, ethics, and community into a lived political order grounded in justice and balance. This is an inheritance. It carries with it responsibility. Because if the modern system has revealed its limits, if it has desacralized what should have never been desacralized, then the task is not only to critique it, but we need to offer something more grounded. The Arab world, perhaps more than any other civilization, stands at this intersection, not simply as a site of conflict, but as a custodian of a civilizational memory in which governance, ethics, and transcendence were never fully separated. This is why the responsibility is greater on Arabs, not because of power alone, but because of inheritance. The old order taught us how to control the world, but it did not teach us how to honor it. What lies ahead is not simply a new balance of power, but the possibility of a different balance altogether. A balance between reason and revelation, a balance between strength and restraint, a balance between order and meaning. And in that balance, if it is to emerge, adab will not be peripheral, it will be foundational. This is the Adab Lab, and this is where clarity begins.